Everybody wants to be independent. We want to be independent people living in independent countries, and it makes perfect sense why. Independence is supposed to equal freedom, right? Well, yes, it does, but the actual truth of the matter is it's more complex than that. You see, in the modern world, arguably, independence is a bad thing and the opposite of freedom. Yep, I'm not joking on this. I'm being deadly serious, but before I explain why, first you've got to remember to subscribe to my channel. The dictionary definition of independent is free from outside control and not subject to another's authority. It also means not depending on another for your livelihood. Now, here's the thing though, does that actually sound like any person who lives in the modern world? I'm pretty certain everybody knows the answer. After all, if it wasn't for the supermarkets, most of us would starve pretty quickly, which means we're all relying on supermarkets, and supermarkets are run by other people, which means we're all dependent on the people running them, along with all the people running all the things that keep our societies going. So things like the police, the army, the gas networks, the electric networks, the water networks, and on the list goes. In fact, it goes on so much, it's clear that we are by far the most dependent group of people in history. In fact, we are such a race of dependents, even the most independent person from the last few decades, who sadly passed away in 2022, can't claim to have been truly independent in the modern world we have created. You see, his name was Man of the Hole. Now, Man of the Hole was the last surviving member of a hunter-gatherer tribe in the Amazon rainforest, and his story is extremely tragic, mainly because the rest of his tribe were murdered in a genocide committed by settlers, and this left him in a situation where he lived completely and entirely on his own. And as he was a hunter-gatherer, that meant he fended completely and entirely for himself on every level. In fact, he was so independent that if every person on earth had died but him, he would have continued living exactly as he had been. And considering this, it would be a fair bet to say that he was dependent on no one but himself, which would imply he was truly independent, except you see, he wasn't. This is because loggers and ranchers wanted him out so they could settle his land, and this led the Brazilian authorities to step in to try to stop them from killing him. But as nobody spoke his language and he was unapproachable, as he was extremely hostile, the only way they could actually do this was basically becoming his invisible guardian angel. They did this by setting up a 40-mile protection zone around his part of the forest, and he was so reliant on this for his safety, even if he never knew it. If it hadn't been for it, he would have died a long time prior to his death in 2022, which means that despite his seeming independence, he was not truly independent. None of us are, and that is actually a good thing, you see. I'll explain why. It's undeniable that Man of the Hole was more independent than the average person, yet what is also undeniable is that he had far less freedoms than the average person. Yep, ever traveled more than 40 miles just on a whim? I bet you have. You've done something that Man of the Hole, despite his independence, never could. This is because he was basically in a prison, and should he have ever wished to have left, his future and whether he could have left would have been debated by Brazilian government officials. That means, rather crazily, Man of the Hole had fewer actual freedoms than the average Brazilian, despite his seeming independence. The latter point may seem questionable, but the average Brazilian can move freely throughout the country, and with a passport can move freely around the world. Man in the Hole could not. Therefore, the most independent man on earth had by far fewer freedoms than the average Brazilian, and yet it is indisputable that he had more independence than the average Brazilian, which is crazy, I know. And I should add at this point, just to avoid any misinterpretations, Brazil is a great country and its people have a great amount of freedom. But the point is, independence does not actually per se equal freedom, which brings me to my next point. Brazil is an independent nation, but that independence status is not the reason for the freedoms that its people have. The best way to understand this is North Korea. North Korea is an independent nation, but you would be hard pushed to find a single person who would say that its people have a great many freedoms. What that means is, being an independent nation does not imply freedom, just as being an independent person doesn't. In fact, even crazier, one of the key ways that dictators get power is by keeping the people as independent from each other as possible. That way, everyone in the country becomes reliant on the dictator, but not each other, which gives the dictator his power. Yep, you heard that right. Keeping people as independent from each other as possible is how dictators actually get and keep power, and it works because it stops people from needing other citizens but keeps them needing the dictator. That means, as paradoxical as it may seem, no one is independent independent, and the more independent we are in this world, the fewer the freedoms we have. That means, rather crazily, if you want freedom in the modern world, what you want is to be dependent on a lot of people, and in return you want a lot of people to be dependent on you. When you think of it, it becomes really obvious why as well. You see, imagine this: two people are living on an island. They agree to work together and decide that they will take turns getting water from the nearby watering hole. By doing this, these two people are giving each other a great freedom. That freedom is to have somebody give you time to yourself, something an independent person can never get. Now let's take this a step further. Imagine one of them decides to specialize in getting water and the other decides to specialize in getting food. In this situation, the one specializing in getting water for both of them is giving the other the freedom to specialize in getting food, and vice versa. You see how that works? Yep, that is how the modern world works. That is the world we have created. It is a world where all of us, by working for each other, give each other immense freedoms we could never have if we were independent. And we use those freedoms and continue to use those freedoms to build this technological world that we live in. That means if you actually want more freedom, you have to stop fighting to be independent, and you have to start fighting to create a world of equal dependency. So a world where everyone is equally relying on each other for their freedoms. The reason, the more who do this, the more freedoms everybody gets, because the more reliant we all become on each other for freedom. And that is the key. You see, if you create a world where everyone is relying on each other for their freedom, what you create is a world full of mass freedoms. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, remember to give it a like and subscribe to my channel, because the more who do, the more of these I can make. Is that a good bribe? I hope it is. I'll see you next time.